Hi, my name is Christopher Scott from the ChristopherScottBlog.com, and today I'm going to talk about how to design your volunteer position descriptions in order to recruit volunteers for your nonprofit or church organization. So today I'm going to give you 10 basic things that you're going to want to do when you design your position descriptions when preparing to recruit volunteers. So some of this material is what I have shared in the workshops I have taught for the Center for Nonprofit Management in Dallas and Fort Worth. And I'm going to be teaching it here on YouTube to try to share it with some more people and help you out. So let's go ahead and get started. So when you design your volunteer position descriptions, there's going to be 10 things that you're going to want to do. And I like to start out with this quote from Marlene Wilson in her book, The Effective Management of Volunteer Programs, where she writes, "We must therefore rethink the jobs we are offering them being volunteers. So we must therefore rethink the jobs we are offering them to be sure that they are generously laced with motivators and not overly encumbered with hygiene factors. The best motivator to keep people on the job is the work itself." So by using these 10 steps to design your volunteer position descriptions, you're going to be able to design better volunteer descriptions to recruit more volunteers and hopefully keep those volunteers at your organization. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that you're going to want to do when you're designing your volunteer position descriptions when you're going to recruit volunteers is to connect the vision of your organization with the passion that potential volunteers have. So you're going to want to connect the vision of your organization with the passion that volunteers have. And you might ask, what's the passion of volunteers? That's a good question. There's 5 main things that motivate volunteers, okay? All volunteers want to contribute to society, the greater good. They want to contribute to an organization, a specific cause or charity. They want clear instructions. They want to feel supported, and they want clear communication, okay? So they want to contribute to society. They want to support the greater good and their local community. They want to contribute to an organization, such as a cause or a specific organization they've been involved with. They want clear instructions about what they're going to be doing in the volunteer position. They want communication that is clear about the position, where to park, what to bring, who to bring, how long they'll be volunteering. And the 5th thing is that they want to feel supported in the position. They want to feel that their time is needed and that they are given the resources they need to do their job effectively as a volunteer. So that's how you're going to want to connect the passion of volunteers to the vision of your nonprofit, is to look at the passion of volunteers and see how you can connect that to the vision of your organization. And when you do this, it helps volunteers stay satisfied with their volunteer experience, and it, as a result, means people will stay there longer. Okay? So the first thing you're going to want to do is connect the vision of your organization to the passion volunteers. The second thing you're going to want to do when designing volunteer position descriptions is you're going to want to realize and remember that commitment level is irrelevant. Some people think, well, if I want to recruit volunteers, I need to create a simple little position that doesn't require much time, or I need to create a big, heavy volunteer position that requires a lot of time. And I want to encourage you, as you design your volunteer position descriptions, that commitment level is irrelevant. High commitment opportunities recruit some volunteers who want to give 10 hours a week for a year and stay committed to that. Other people are going to be drawn into the lower commitment volunteer opportunities where they only need to give 1 hour a week for 5 weeks, and that's it. So it's good to remember that. So in designing volunteer positions descriptions, remember that commitment level is irrelevant. The third thing that you're going to want to do when designing your volunteer positions is look for opportunities to get their feet wet and test the waters of your organization. I like this quote from Bill Hybels in his book, The Volunteer Revolution, where he writes, "If I had to sum up the key to finding the perfect serving niche, I'd do it with one word: experiment." Meaning let people get involved, start out in the organization, start doing things, and see how they like it. So when you're trying to look for opportunities to get people lightly involved, here's some things that you can do to do that. Number 1, it's good to ask, why should you only get people lightly involved at the beginning of a volunteer position? And the reason you're going to want to get people lightly involved is because their motives to volunteer can and will change over time. Meaning the reason that people begin volunteering for a nonprofit organization is different than why they continue to volunteer for a nonprofit organization. And I say that because based on research, in the beginning, volunteers volunteer because they want to make a difference in the lives of people and they want to support the organization that they work for. However, research shows that volunteers continue and stay at a nonprofit organization long term because of the connections they make and the relationships that they make, because of the benefits that they receive and the connections that they make at a nonprofit organization. Another reason you're going to want to get people lightly involved is that people don't know what to expect from your volunteer experience. So you don't want to try to lock them in long term when they don't even know what they're going to experience or if they're going to like it. So people are not certain of what to experience when volunteering, so get them lightly involved into a basic job with not a lot of commitment. A great example of this is the animal shelter in the county that I used to work in when I worked at the United Way. So we'd have lots of people call us and they'd want to go volunteer at the animal shelter. They had these expectations that they were going to go to the animal shelter, see all these cute puppies and kittens, and they'd be happy. You know, these puppies and kittens would be happy to see the people, and grateful people were there to take care of them. So that was their expectation when they went. But when they got there, they realized that they were walking into an uncovered area where all the dogs and cats were kept in cages that were muddy and smelly and stinky, and it didn't match the experience that they thought they would have. So their expectations didn't match the experience that they thought that they would have. Another reason you're going to want to get people lightly involved is that people are trying to fulfill their needs and emotional expectations. So volunteers, like all people, have needs. They need to feel appreciated, they need to feel valued, and they need to see a clear picture of the work being done. Additionally, volunteers have emotional expectations. They want to know that they make a difference with the work they do. They want to know that financial resources are being used effectively at the organization, and they want to see clients that are being served and appreciate that service. So that's another reason you're going to want to get volunteers lightly involved at the beginning, so that they can hopefully find appreciation and value as being a volunteer, as well as seeing some of their expectations followed through on, such as being able to make a difference, work with clients, things like that. So, how to use short-term projects to get people lightly involved. So you have volunteers, you're trying to get them lightly involved, as I adjust the screen here a little bit. So you're trying to get people lightly involved. What can you do to do that? All right, so the first thing you're going to want to do when you're trying to get volunteers lightly involved is to have a specific time limit. Let them know you only need them to volunteer for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 months, whatever that might be, right? So give them a specific time limit. This week I just started volunteering with the First Tee, actually in our community, and it's great because each volunteer commitment is just 5 weeks. Each program is 5 weeks long, then they take 2 weeks off, then they launch another 5-week program. Then they take the summer off and they launch another 5-week program in the fall. So that's great because all of that is getting people lightly involved. They get to test it out. They get to see if they like it. If they don't like it, then it's great. They automatically have an out. Another thing you're going to want to do when you try to get people lightly involved is to use your best volunteers. Okay, so you have these brand new volunteers coming into your organization. Not use your best volunteers. You're going to want to use your best leaders. Okay. So you have these volunteers coming into your organization to serve and help out. The thing that you're going to want to do is place those new volunteers with the best leaders you have, whether they are staff or other volunteers. You want those new volunteers to have a great experience and to learn the correct habits up front that you want them to learn. Additionally, you're going to want to try to open doors for long-term opportunities. So don't let a volunteer come in, work for 4 weeks, and then let them just leave without you having another conversation about an additional opportunity or additional way they can get lightly involved. So don't just limit it to only serving for 2 weeks or 4 weeks without at least engaging them and letting them know there's another step, there's another thing that you need help with that you can plug them into. So you can also get volunteers lightly involved through holidays and special events are great ways to do this because often you need lots of volunteers that don't necessarily need skills and training, right? So if it's a fundraiser event that you have, You just need 5 volunteers to sit at the table and hand out name tags to people coming in. Or at a holiday event for Thanksgiving or Christmas, all you need is 20 young men to just pick up bags of beans and move them across the room when you need them to. Okay, so holiday events and special events are great opportunities to get people lightly involved, because you often need a lot of volunteers, but they don't have to always be skilled and trained to do a specific task. And also, when you're trying to get volunteers lightly involved, you're going to want to provide an out for you and your volunteers. You're going to want to do this on the front end before the person starts volunteering. You're going to want to provide a specific time limit for when that volunteer is needed. And then you're going to want to provide a specific time limit for when that volunteer will no longer be needed, right? So the example that I like to share is of a volunteer that we had named Aaron, not his real name, that came and volunteered for me at the United Way for about a year and a half. And I met Aaron actually through his mom. His mom was a teller at a local bank, and I got to know her just from coming in and making deposits regularly and talking to her. And she told me about her son and how her son went to a program during the school year, obviously, throughout the day, but during the summer he was very bored. So I said, you know what? I'm going to have some work going on for these 3 months. I'm going to be really busy. I'm wondering if your son would like to come in and help. And I was very, very clear to her when talking about this volunteer need that I had, that it was only 3 months, and that if after 3 months I wasn't really sure if I would have work for him to help with. So at that time, we would have to reconnect and re-talk and assess what the needs would be going forward. So right there, even though I had never met Aaron, never talked to him, I just knew he had some free time and that his mom wanted to get him involved. I was able to provide an out for us in case he wasn't working out as a volunteer, or if I wasn't working out as someone who oversaw him as a volunteer. Okay? So the next thing you're going to want to do, the fourth thing, when you're trying to design your volunteer position descriptions, is you're going to want to be clear about what will and will not be done, while also connecting the vision of your organization to the position. Okay? So be clear about what will and will not be done in your position description. And this is going to be in the part of your description where you just write out the things a volunteer will do throughout their experiences. So will the volunteer be doing administrative work, interacting with clients? How long will it take the volunteer to complete the work? Do they need to work 8-hour days, 2-hour days? Is it flexible? What role will the volunteer play in the organization? I like the example from Gain, which is a nonprofit in Plano. Their job description talks about gathering stuff, people, and prayer. You can either gather stuff for us to send overseas, you can gather people who will raise funds and gather stuff, or you can gather prayer. 3 basic things that all volunteers did there. Another thing that you can do to be clear about what will and will not be done is you might not put all of this in your volunteer description, but you're at least going to know it in your head. So even if you don't take the time to write out a volunteer position description, you're going to always at least know these things in your head and be able to describe it to volunteers. A fifth thing you can do to design great volunteer position descriptions is to describe how the work will be done as it relates to your organization's vision, right? So talk about, in your position description, talk about whether or not volunteers will be working alone or with other volunteers. Will volunteers be closely supervised and managed? Will there be, where will the volunteers park? Basic things like that. Where do they go? Where do they park? Do they need to bring their own lunch? Basic things like that. What do they need to wear? All right? So you're going to want to describe how the work will be done and how it relates to the vision of the organization. Sixth, actually, we're going fast here. The sixth thing you can do to design great volunteer position descriptions is to outline the required training and qualifications that volunteers are required to have in order to volunteer, right? So what are the basic requirements? Do they need to be CPR trained? Do they need a driver's license? Do they need to do background checks? Are there a security guard? Do they need to know karate? Stuff like that. But put that in there. What are the basic requirements? And then also list what skills and strengths do volunteers need to inherently possess. And when I say skills or strengths, these are things maybe that are inherent to the volunteer position. Do they need to be good with people, good with numbers, things like that. And when you're outlining the training and qualifications, you're going to want to write out What kind of training do volunteers need to go through in order to begin to volunteer? What kind of training do they need to go through in order to continue volunteering? Or what maybe would disqualify volunteers from being able to volunteer? Is it a past felony conviction, poor driving record, drug abuse, things like that? So put those things in your position description. What kind of training qualifications do they need to become a volunteer, to continue to be a volunteer, things like that. A seventh thing you can do when designing volunteer position descriptions is to look at the different generations of volunteers. So you'll kind of want to look at the traditionalists, the boomers, Generation X, and millennials. And there's tons of research out there that you can look at. You can find it online. Just Google them. And you can look up, okay, think through my position description. Which of these 4 generations do I want to volunteer for me? And then look at the describing factors of each generation and try to put that in your position description and use the things that describe people in that generation as a way to attract them to your volunteer position. Number 8, when you're designing volunteer position descriptions, don't forget about youth and people with disabilities, right? So these are great people to have help with your nonprofit organization or church, because often people who are teenagers or younger, as well as people with disabilities, sometimes have more free time than a 30-year-old mom who works full-time and has 3 kids, okay? It's just the reality of life that people who are young or people who have disabilities sometimes have a little bit more time in order to help, because they're often not working full-time jobs or they haven't started a family yet. So, what do you need to know about when working with youth? I wrote down some characteristics of youth that I think are good to share if you're going to try to recruit teenagers or people younger to volunteer for your organization. So some of the characteristics of youth that I wrote down: they move fast, they can work long periods of time without taking a break, most of them are limber and strong, they often don't have the social norms knowledge that you and I have, right? So they might not have some of the basic understandings of, if someone asks you how you're doing, you should ask them how they're doing back, right? I remember my dad teaching me that when I was 13 or 14. Christopher, when someone says, how are you? You tell them good, and you ask them back. Don't be rude and just say good and then walk off, right? Sometimes teenagers don't have those social norms understanding that adults do. And they're teenagers, that's okay. Some additional things about youth you need to know if you're going to recruit youth to work in your program is that all youth are highly capable with computers and technology, right? So we have, this year is 2016, and we've got an entire generation of kids growing up that, let's say there's a 12-year-old now. That 12-year-old has literally been able to have an iPod since he or she was born, right? iPods first came out from Apple in 2004, I think, 2003. So even if you have a 18-year-old, this kid has been able to have an iPod, 1,000 songs on a little tiny little piece of metal for pretty much his whole life, right? So they're good with technology, they've grown up with it, they don't care about cassette players or CDs, but they're good with technology, they understand it, and they use it. Some more things about youth is they often are teachable because they have fewer ideas about how things should be done. Because they are new at a lot of jobs and tasks, they can sometimes be teachable. Because of they can get bored easily. Okay, so that's one thing, right? Things got to be fast and moving for youth, otherwise they get bored easily. And if you're going to work with youth, you'll need the consent from parents for them to volunteer, because they are underage, under 18, which means they can't sign consent forms, liability releases, so you're going to need to get parent approval. So if you work with youth and recruit them to volunteer, some other things that you'll need to do if you're going to work with them. So because of these factors that I've just listed for you about youth, you're going to need to provide good communication in writing, both to the youth and the parents, okay? You're going to need to give them reminders about everything. Teenagers forget stuff. You got to give them reminders constantly. You're going to need to text them with information. Don't call them and don't email, just text them. Might find it more beneficial to talk directly to a parent. So if there's specific instructions you need to give to youth, It's better just to give it to the parents sometimes. Youth, you must find ways to keep their attention, right? So keep them on task, give them different jobs to do, mix it up, keep it going. You'll need to entertain them if possible. So when I worked with teenagers doing car washes as fundraisers, we used to do that twice a month for one of the nonprofit charities I worked with. I always had music out. It was just something to play in the background to kind of keep them motivated, to try to entertain them a little bit with music. And lastly, you can put youth with their friends if possible. They like to interact, they like to talk, so if you can match them up with their friends and let them work together, that always seems to work better. So now let's talk about people with disabilities. I've got experience working with volunteers with disabilities. So there's 7 characteristics of people with intellectual disabilities that I'd like to share, and I want to give you some things that you'll need to do as a result of that if you do work with volunteers who have disabilities. So some of the characteristics of people with intellectual disabilities. This is mostly just based on my experience and observation. This isn't clinical, this isn't scientifically based, this is just my observations of having to work in the trenches with volunteers who have intellectual difficulties, right? Intellectual disabilities, not difficulties. So people with intellectual disabilities often desire a routine. They like to do the same thing over and over again in the same place in the same way. Some do not talk much, others like to talk a lot, so you just got to take each one individually. They are good at maintaining a focus on the work. So usually you can put people with intellectual disabilities down to do a task, and they'll focus on that task for 2 hours and do it well. They are often happy to do any type of work. Just the fact that you've reached out to someone with a disability and provided them some work to do often really means a lot to them, that they feel valued and appreciated, that someone looks to them for their help. The 6th thing is that they do not know social norms, kind of like teenagers. Sometimes they're not as in tune to the social norms that you and I maybe understand. And they are often really good at some specific things, so don't be surprised if you give them a job to do and they do it better than you were able to do. Sometimes just because they have an intellectual disability that affects them in one area doesn't mean it affects them in all areas of life. So because of these things, when you work with volunteers with intellectual disabilities, you have to be very clear and communicate things to them multiple times, right? So communicate it to them, show them, monitor them throughout the process. You're going to need to set boundaries. What can they do and what can't they do? And they must know the limits of what they can and cannot do. So you got to lay that out for them. So one example is of that volunteer, Aaron, that I had shared with you, whose mom was a bank teller. He came to our office for about 1.5 years to do volunteer work, and he was great. He called his volunteer work for us. He came in 2 days a week for about 2.5 hours. He called it his job. He loved it. His favorite day of the month was the day that we had staff meetings, and he got to go into the staff meeting and sit there as part of the staff, right? He loved it. He was pretty flexible as far as being able to work in different areas of the office. So if I needed to move him to a different desk, he was okay with that most of the time. He was really good at being specific and focused. So I remember the first time or two he came in to volunteer, we sat him down for 2 hours. He just sat there and worked. He never moved. He didn't talk to anybody. He didn't even go to the bathroom. I had to go talk to him and say, hey, let me show you where the bathroom is if you need to go. And then he went. So I guess he needed to go. But he never said anything. He was just focused on doing his work. So the ninth thing that you're going to want to do when you're creating your volunteer position descriptions is you're going to want to make it as easy as possible for volunteers to contact you. Okay? So make it easy for volunteers to contact you. Don't make them go to a website and fill out a form. Don't make them go to some other place and fill out a form. Don't make them, come into your office and fill out a paper form, okay? Put your phone number on the volunteer position descriptions, put your email, put your website, whatever. Anything you can do to get them engaged with you to talk and volunteer. Let's say there is a big long form volunteers need to fill out, but let them contact you, at least let them contact you up front to ask a question if they have it. Okay? And make it easy for them to contact you and get engaged with you. And then the 10th thing that you're going to want to do to create volunteer position descriptions is that you're going to want to DUA. Okay? DUA. Do you know what DUA means? Probably not. DUA means don't use acronyms. So this is something I really push hard on when I teach this workshop live, because we'll often have 10 or 15 organizations in the room, and there's lots of acronyms that they have in the organizations, and I can kind of pick on them a little bit, but don't use acronyms, okay? So don't use acronyms in your volunteer position description, even if you spell out the acronym first, right? So in academic writing, we're taught that you'll spell out the long acronym first in the paragraph, and then each time after that, just use the acronym. Well, in a volunteer position description, just type everything out every single time. Don't abbreviate it, don't use acronyms, just type it out for them, okay? So don't use acronyms even if you spell it out early in the position descriptions. Don't use acronyms even if you think people know what it means. So an example is CPS, right? So my wife works for an organization that partners with CPS, and there's probably been 2 or 3 times that she's met people and she's talked about interacting with CPS. Now I know that CPS means Child Protective Services, and she knows that, and probably most people do, but a lot of times it doesn't really connect with people up front. They say CPS, she says CPS, and then they think, and then my wife realizes that they don't understand what CPS means, and then she explains it, and they're like, oh yes. So even if you think an acronym is widespread and known, still don't use it. Just spell it out, just type it out in your position description. Sometimes acronyms stand for different things in different industries, which is another great reason not to use acronyms, okay? So for examples, ACH means the automated clearing house. So if you're getting a payroll deduction from your check or a direct deposit, it's called an ACH deduction. However, in Dallas, ACH stands for All Church Home, okay? But they just call it ACH. Another reason is that acronyms often mean different things in different industries. So if you talk about a CIO in a bank is a chief investment officer, but a CIO in an information and tech company is a chief information officer. So another great reason not to use acronyms is they mean different things to different people in different organizations and industries. However, you can use acronyms if your organization's name is an acronym, okay? So that has occurred in some organizations where they get rid of the name and just go with the acronym, right? So ACH, Child and Family Services here in the Dallas and Fort Worth area. You can use acronyms if your organization's acronym stands for words that are no longer relevant for your work. So in Sonora, California, there's an organization that is called WATCH, and they work with people with intellectual and physical disabilities. And that H in the word WATCH stands for handicapped, but they don't go with their full name anymore. They just go by WATCH because handicapped is now a term that's not really politically correct or accurate to use of people with those type of disabilities, right? So if an organization has words in their name that are no longer politically correct, then it's okay just to go with the acronym. Last thing to talk about, or another reason to use acronyms, right? I give you 3 reasons you can use acronyms, but not always recommended. Another reason to use an acronym is if people can't pronounce your name, okay? So an example is ALS, the ALS organization, okay? I can't remember even what it stands for, but it's really, really hard to pronounce. I have it on a PowerPoint where we try to pronounce it in class when I teach this workshop in person. But ALS, right? It's better just to go with ALS because people can't pronounce that name. All right, so those are 10 reasons or 10 ways that you can design great volunteer position descriptions in order to recruit volunteers for your organization, okay? So the first thing that you're going to want to do is connect your organization's vision with the passion of volunteers. You're going to remember that commitment level is irrelevant. Third, you're going to look for opportunities to get volunteers' feet wet in the organization, get them lightly involved. Fourth, you want to be clear about what will and will not be done. Fifth, describe how the work will be done as it relates to your vision. Sixth, outline the required training and qualifications and why volunteers need them. Seventh, consider the different generations and who might be attracted to this volunteer position. Eighth, don't forget about youth and people with disabilities. 9, make it easy for people to connect with you. And 10, don't use acronyms. All right, so those are 10 things you can do to design great volunteer position descriptions that will help you recruit more volunteers for your nonprofit organization or your church. My name is Christopher Scott from the Biblical Leadership blog at christopherscottblog.com, and this video has been part of my series trying to help churches and nonprofit organizations recruit more volunteers. If you want to learn more about recruiting volunteers and leadership, you can go to christopherscottblog.com. If you have any other suggestions about how to create great volunteer positions descriptions, you can write those suggestions in the comment box down below. Thanks for listening.